You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and this is episode 164 of the Rock Art Podcast. We're blessed and honored to have Dr. Bellezza, all the way from Tibet, and he's one of the glitterati of rock art and also anthropology, archaeology, has been a remarkable researcher and scholar. And I welcome you, Dr. Bellezza. It's a blessing.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Alan. Much appreciated.
So the million-dollar question is always, how'd you ever get yourself involved in such an esoteric field? Such an interesting niche, your study of Tibet, prehistory, archaeology, and cosmology.
Well, I think I could have gone in many different directions. I always had some interest in Tibet. I mean, I think like a lot of people, it was a fascinating, faraway place. I had the good fortune in January 1983 to end up in India.
Oh, wow.
And with not a lot of money, but it was in the middle of Old Delhi, which is a very hectic, bustling kind of place, and felt kind of strangely at home. That just one thing led to another, and I pretty much stayed in India, used it as a base of operations. And then beginning in 1984, I went to Tibet, and then again for a very long period in 86, 87. Then I was basically a tourist or a traveler, but with interest, with a quite deep interest. The more I learned, the more I wanted to know. So I began not from an illustrious academic career so much as just being on the ground, seeing a lot, needing to learn about the people and the languages, to survive, and also because of my curiosity. And, so as an autodidact, one thing led to another, and it built up over time. By the early, and spent, just roved all around the Himalaya and Tibet, covered great distances on foot, saw a lot, learned a lot. It was a great experiential, kind of adventure. And eventually I got my PhD, but that was later. And so I really see myself as being self-educated in the sense that I went out into the world, basically just me, a backpack, a camera, and a notebook, and began recording about all kinds of things. And again, by early 90s, by 1992, I realized I wanted to focus on ancient Tibet. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So it was a gradual process. And I think if anyone is beginning an academic career, I would encourage them to, a program of research, just fly with it and, work hard, explore, be curious, and little by little, you'll get somewhere. I think perseverance really is a key.
Absolutely. I would agree wholeheartedly with that. What was the academic track? How did you connect with a proper university and get your credentials? Was that difficult or no?
It wasn't that difficult. It was much later in the 2000s. I enrolled with Kent University in the UK.
Okay.
Yes. And it wasn't that difficult because I already had a lot of publications, a lot of work behind me. So I was able to get a PhD in a quite unusual fashion by work I had already done, which I then had to assemble, create a methodology with my supervisors, PhD supervisors, and then submit that as my dissertation. And of course, I had oral examinations from that were held by experts in the field.
Yeah, well, it's very fortunate in terms of having that kind of background to go into the scholarly realm and have your work count. So where'd you go from there?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think, being a mature scholar really gives one an edge.
Yes.
Because, not only do you have the experience, but you pretty much know what you want to do. So it makes the whole academic, the institutional program a lot easier, really.
Definitely. I went to UC Davis myself and found it highly political, if you believe it or not. So, but I was one of those people that got my PhD rather late in life. I started and then stopped and then finished it up later. So it was an interesting journey. So you focused on both the pre and post Buddhism platform, haven't you, in terms of your research? No?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested really in the whole spectrum of Tibetan civilization from the Bronze Age onwards. And then because there was so little that was known, so little had been done about Tibet concerning this early period, right up and through the imperial period, which is when Tibet had a great empire in the 7th and 8th, early 9th centuries. Tibet was one of the contending powers in Eurasia. That had been studied. The imperial period had been studied from a textual basis, but there was very little that had been done on the ground. I mean, I was really lucky. I was just there at the right time. Tibet opened up to the world to travelers in 1984. People had gotten there early, a little bit earlier. But it was in 84 they were allowing individual tourists to go in. And so we were able to see things that no one had seen for about 50 years.
Wow. How exciting. Really different. So you had an age of discovery and revelation, I'm sure. And
yeah, it was a great period.
Where did you first work? What did you do? What did you do initially?
Well, at first, one thing in the early period was learning languages. You're not going to get around very well, and you're certainly not going to learn as much as you could unless you're able to speak to the people
Right.
in their own languages. So that was key. There's maybe two ways to go about learning a language: through experience or formally. I guess ideally you would do both.
Mm-hmm.
But being on the ground in Tibet, that was a golden period, September 84 to September 1987. And there were a group of us that spent a lot of time there in Tibet at that time, and we were going places that Westerners had never been before. So it was quite exciting to be the first, non-Tibetan, first Westerner to arrive in places. I mean, Tibet was really one of the last terra incognita on the planet, really.
So what revelations did you have, and what did you think about these places that hadn't been seen?
I mean, I came to appreciate that Tibet was really the last of the traditional, of the pre-modern civilizations. Now, of course, that era had ended by the 1980s under Chinese jurisdiction, but it was quite something to see how people once lived and could live well and did live well without too many modern accoutrements.
And you were able to immerse yourself in the language and learn it?
Immerse myself in the languages, dialects.
Yes, languages, yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
wow.
Himalaya and in Tibet, we're talking, there are literally hundreds of languages.
Wow.
And so, you're probably not going to learn, at least I wasn't going to learn hundreds of languages. So, you focus on the lingua franca in each region.
Right.
And that's very helpful. And then,
I'm
of course, then you need literary skills, because I guess we'll go into that. You want to be able to read the literature. Tibet was a civilization, in a sense. It was a highly literate culture that had produced tens of thousands, if not millions, of different literary works over the course of 1,300 years.
That is amazing. It probably felt a bit overwhelming as well. But where did you start and what did you learn?
Yeah, I mean, what do they say? A trip of 1,000 miles, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. And, and so with my work, really, I mean, you go step by step. You may make mistakes. You'll learn things. There may be dead ends. There may be some promising avenues. But little by little, if as we were saying, you persevere, you will make progress. And then things build upon themselves. If you don't give up, little by little, you get more experience, more knowledge, and it's kind of a synergy. And the more you know, the more you learn. Of course, at the same time, you realize the more you know, the less you really know, because it becomes more and more doors open, more potentialities, more possibilities present themselves. So, the learning experience is a never ending quest. I never wanted to really be in the confines of an institution. I was so lucky to manage my life where I was able to stay in the field all those years. And that's why
Wow.
I think I was quite productive, because I didn't really teach except, seminars and lectures. And so I was able to just focus on my research. And that's what I still do after all these years. It's research. I'm a research scholar. Learning and sharing what I know is what I like to do.
Did you begin with the Buddhist expression or the pre-Buddhist earlier expression?
That's a good question. I mean, Tibetan Buddhism, of course, is a fascinating and really sophisticated religion, and so colorful, rather exotic by Western standards.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, yes, Buddhism, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous in Tibet, the presence of Buddhism among the people of Tibet. So, inescapable Buddhism, and interested in that in and of itself. But I realized I was on the ground. I didn't just have texts to work with. I could actually speak with people. I could go in the field. I could see ruins. I could see, customs traces in the customs and traditions of the people that seemed ancient. And so I really picked my interest, and I realized what was happening before Buddhism. And there wasn't much written about it. And so that spurred me on, because exploration was really the cornerstone of what I wanted to do and accomplish.
It sounds like it was in its infancy too, because there wasn't that much known or wasn't that much done.
It was very much in its infancy. In the 1980s, 1990s, very little was being done. There were some anecdotal studies. There were beginnings of excavations. Well, you can trace the excavations in Tibet back into the 1980s, but it really wasn't until the late 90s that the archaeology started to really gain momentum in Tibet.
Let's stop there. It'd be a good place to pick it up at the next segment. See you in the flip-flop, gang. Welcome back, gang. This is episode 164 of your Rock Art podcast. We're honored and blessed to be talking to Dr. John Bellezza. And we were just at the cusp of beginning to talk about your work in the pre-Buddhist segment, trying to understand a bit about the prehistory and the archaeology and the lifeways and cosmology of that interesting part of the past for Tibet. So continue with the saga, John.
Okay, we'll do. Pre-Buddhist Tibet. Well, there were a few problems. It was such a straightforward process. First of all, not unlike in, the Christian world, pre-Christian, where you have pre-Christian or pagan traditions, which for an awful long time were either buried, assimilated, or actually even forbidden. So there's a somewhat similar process taking place in Tibet. Once Buddhism exploded on the scene beginning in the 7th century AD, it began erasing, assimilating, absorbing earlier traditions, customs, technologies that had existed. At the same time, so much of the ancient world, the pre-Buddhist world, was eliminated, vanished, disappeared from the collective memory. So there was a resistance, you would say. It was really a resistance. There was even a resistance among many academics, because mostly their teachers had been Buddhist clerics.
Uh-huh.
The pre-Buddhist world was not seen as something really fit to study, maybe something exotic, maybe some of the legends recorded in the texts and oral traditions were true, maybe they weren't, but no one was that quite certain. Now, there were, earlier in the 20th century, there were great explorers, Tibetologists like R.A. Stein and Giuseppe Tucci of Italy and France, respectively, who made some progress and were very interested in what was going on before Buddhism was there. How were the people living? How do they sustain themselves economically? What kind of technologies do they have? So these questions came to the fore in the first half of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. But then, due to the communistic occupation of Tibet, there wasn't really much scope to study them in the field until the 1980s and 90s, when my generation came of age.
And where did you begin?
I began basically by doing a lot of footwork. Okay, well, I'll give you an example here. Well, in 1987, a number of us were living in Lhasa, which is the erstwhile capital of Inner Tibet, and now the capital of what the Chinese call the Tibet Autonomous Region. A letter had reached us from H.E. Richardson, who was one time the British political officer, and happened to be a Tibetologist who had done great work and has some amazing publications behind him. Richardson sent us a letter and says, well, listen, to a travelers co-op that existed and I volunteered with when I wasn't in the field in that mid-'80s period. A letter reaches us saying, well, we hear there are pyramids in Tibet. Well, because Nain Singh in the 1870s, Nain Singh and Kishan Singh, they're reporting all these interesting sites in Tibet, including existence of a giant pyramid. I was quite young at the time. I was, just in my 20s. Uh-huh. Well, this could be a lot of fun, This could be really exciting. Discover a pyramid in Tibet. That should make some headlines.
Sure.
So off I went and went to this area, Lake Namtso, in north of Lhasa, over the Trans-Himalaya, and started looking, and at the same time I'm meeting people and I'm seeing all kinds of other things, early sites, islands that reputed to have been the haunts of these ancient peoples that once existed. Make a long story short, couldn't find the pyramid. I went back again in 91, 92, 93, kept looking for this pyramid. Couldn't find it. Then finally, I found it. Well, it dawned on me, basically. The pyramid, there was a pyramid, but it wasn't a man-made pyramid. There were two pyramidal limestone formations rising out of the lake. And this lake, Sky Lake, is an amazing lake. It, according to tradition, it reflects the color of the sky with perfect fidelity, which is, more or less true. So find these two natural formations. One of the formations has a passageway in it, just as described by these pundits, these spies that were under the employ of the British. Mm-hmm. Found a passage, but the stairway in it, the stone stairs, had been destroyed mostly, and I couldn't get up to the top. Well, I kept thinking about it, and it finally, and a lot of other things happened in between. 2008, I was determined. I had done a lot of mountain climbing. I think when you live in the Himalaya, you certainly need climbing skills in Tibet too. And so finally, I decided I'm going to get up there one way or another, And so I, shimmied my way, free climbed up these vertical walls of the passageway.
Oh my word!
Got to the top and found that there were ruins up there of all places.
Oh my word!
There weren't even houses. Most of the nomads, the herders, the Drokpa, as they're known, in that area around Sky Lake, lived in yak hair tents until the 1990s. But here was this complex. Not only was this ancient complex, but it was built on top of a pyramidal formation. And so, it was things like that. So I realized that the story wasn't false. It was just a little different than the pundits had, described in their reports.
Yeah, and it was nonetheless remarkable. What was the elevation at the top of that pyramid?
Well, even at the base of the pyramid, you're at more than 4,700 meters, more than 15,500 feet,
which is getting rather thin. Wow,
the air's thin up there. It's the highest. The remains up there, and then this is basically, I should say, that this
the highest remains.
The high, and not just there, but all over this upper portion of Tibet, the northern and western half of the plateau. I mean, averaging around 4,600, averaging around 15,000 feet in elevation. Highest sedentary culture, highest aspect of civilization the world had ever seen.
Amazing. So what were they doing up there? Herding?
Well, this is, and a lot. And remember, I don't work in isolation.
No.
Eventually, particularly in the 2000s, then you
Yes.
started having various kinds of studies. And, the more that's done, the more it helps me understand my own data, my own research. And
Of course.
so we basically, it's clear that there was herding up there, the herding of yaks, sheep, and goats. Also, it was a horse culture. We can talk about that because that's quite important. Not unlike Mongolia, Tibetans were very fond of equestrians.
Mm-hmm.
So we know in that early period, it's particularly more recently, now we're having evidence from burials that have been excavated in Western Tibet, in the Gugge region, that pastoralism, this kind of a semi-nomadic pastoralism, they weren't true nomads. It would just as in more recent times, there was an annual circuit with a winter headquarters or home base. But there's evidence now suggesting through proteomics and the recovery of milk lipids in pottery that pastoralism was in place by about 1500 BC. So, fairly early for that part of the world. So pastoralism, clearly from the rock art, also from a textual basis, hunting remained very important. Unlike many other places in the world, Upper Tibet is vast. I mean, it's the size of Texas and maybe throw in Oklahoma and New Mexico at the same time. And the top third of it is virtually uninhabited, just a place where animals, large wild ungulates like wild yak, Tibetan antelopes, wild asses live. So there was plenty to hunt. And they were fond hunters. And even maybe after, it's quite clear from the rock art that even after pastoralism was introduced and agriculture, now probably agriculture begins around this same time as pastoralism. However, the hard evidence suggests that agriculture came to Upper Tibet in the first millennium BC, but it probably goes back further. We just don't have the evidence because as much as has been done by myself and others, some of my colleagues, Tibet archaeology is still in its infancy. There's just so much to learn and explore still. So, my work basically in my various books, etc., articles, they open up a kind of world, but we really have to fill in the blanks. And that will be a multi-generational process. So for those who say that there's nothing left to explore in the world, I would say there actually is. There's still a lot to do. And fundamental stuff too. Yeah. The nature of early civilization in Tibet. We have the outline. I surveyed, hundreds of early sites. We could talk about that if you like, hundreds of early sites, megalithic sites, etc. But this is really just the very beginning.
Just the start. What kind of rock art is there? The pre-Buddhist rock art. Is there a lot of animals represented?
Yes. Over the years, beginning in 95 and then really just finishing now, I've finished 4 volumes, 6 books, but there's 2 more that are just about ready for publication in this year. It's a comprehensive study of rock art. Now, of course, comprehensive but not exhaustive because, rock art has a way of just, new sites being found and there's still so much more. Even if, I produce 8 books on rock art, there'll be probably many more to come because there'll be so many new discoveries. You could divide rock art in Tibet basically into the pre-Buddhist and Buddhist periods or the prehistoric and historic eras. I refer to the period from the late Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the Protohistoric period, which was talked about in Tibetan texts as time of the Tibetan kings, as a late prehistoric era. So from around roughly 1200 BC to 600 AD. Is this period of the late prehistoric era. And then after 600 AD, we have the historic era. So this is a big division here, and you can see it this chasm exists all throughout Tibet. Because once Buddhism comes around the same time in the 7th century, Tibetan literacy develops and a
Right.
Tibetan empire arises. And so this was a time of great changes, fundamental changes in the trajectory of Tibetan civilization, which are trenchantly visible in the rock art.
Sure. Let's stop there. It seems a good stopping part. And we'll pick it up on the last segment. See you in the flip-flop, gang. Well, we're back, folks. We're in the segment 3 of the Rock Art Podcast. And we're just blessed to have Dr. John Bellezza. And he's going to finish us up and talk more about his work on Tibet prehistory. Go ahead, John. Give us a heads up about some of the things you think were probably the most important contributions you may have had and the things that surprised you.
Yes, well, surprise is really part of the game. I mean, you're always, your interest is being picked and your curiosity, because there are just so many discoveries that are possible. As far as some of the highlights of my work, well, there was a physical exploration. I believe I was the first non-Tibetan to visit all 4 of the sources of the great rivers that arise in Western Tibet near Mount Kailash, one of the holiest mountains in Asia. I also completed some of the first translations of Old Tibetan mytho-ritual texts. They've been worked on by other people, but very difficult language, no lexicons of the language from that period, that early literacy period in Tibet, and a lot of strange customs, traditions, motifs that had disappeared in classical Tibetan literature. So I had to work backwards. First, I learned classical Tibetan, and then once I had classical Tibetan, I really had to teach myself with the help of Tibetan savants, Old Tibetan. And so that I could, because, the Old Tibetan would allow me to understand archaic cultural traditions that existed in Tibet in the imperial period, and which were to some degree relevant to even earlier periods. So
I would episodes, and those would be critical to better understand the prehistory of Tibet.
Yes, let me give you an example. Funerary text.
Yes.
The mytho-ritual funerary text speak of traditions such as the use of guides of the dead in the form of sheep and horses that you actually find in the text. The text actually explain the use of these psychopomps in these early evocation rituals for the souls of the deceased, which were believed in some cases, if they died in untoward circumstances, like because of disease or murder, those kind of terrible forms of mortality, that their souls would be wandering around and would come under the control of these infernal demons that try to not only capture the soul, but keep it in the underworld. And it was the function of the funerary priest, what they call the Dorshen in Tibetan, to extricate the souls from the various layers of the hell realms, bring it back to the surface of the earth, create vehicles to protect the soul, and guarantee its safe harborage to the afterlife.
Wow. And is any of this expressed in the burial customs or in the rock art?
Yes. I mean, certainly we find remains of the psychopomp and the other kinds of sacrificial offerings in tombs mentioned in the text, maybe not in the exact same configuration, but the basic themes are most certainly there. And, out of this comes some interesting parallels, because the funerary texts speak of horses with horned headdresses. Mm-hmm. Well, where you find horses with horned headdresses in funerary rites are among the Scytho-Siberians of the second half of the first millennium BC. So the Scythians apparently pioneered the use of these headdresses with deer and horns and bird features, ornithic features, that the Tibetans absorbed early on and retained in their funerary texts much later. In the rock art, of course, you find all kinds of mundane and supramundane rock art subjects and compositions. So you find various kinds of horned anthropomorphs, but maybe either priests, sages, or deities, theomorphic deities with horned headdresses or actually horns on their head. So we have that in the rock art. We have chariots in the rock art. Now, people, when you think about Buddhism, you think, well, they didn't use the wheel as transportation, and they hadn't for an awful long time. But we know from the rock art record that Tibetans had two-wheeled vehicles, horse-drawn. Not only did they have chariots, these chariots are very similar to those found throughout North Inner-Asia. In other words, we find the same types of chariots in Mongolia, southern Siberia, Central Asia, and in burials even further afield, for instance, in central plains of China. So
what were the chariots used for?
That's a very good question. Now, the possibilities are they were actually building chariots. The other possibility is that they were figurative, and the chariots were symbolic instruments for perhaps funerary customs or for statecraft. Yeah. So both possibilities are there. I mean, some of the chariots that were carved in Tibet are fairly detailed. I mean, even with the charioteer, we have one petroglyph of a charioteer. It appears to be donning a horned headdress.
Yes.
With the reins in one hand. Yeah.
I think I've seen some pictures of those horned headdressed horses, and they are outlandish, just outrageous. Your jaw drops and your eyes pop out as to how beautiful and otherworldly they are. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, some of the rock art, like everywhere in the world, but some of the Tibetan rock art, it's highly evocative.
I read in one of the summaries of some of your research, and this may surprise you, I don't know if you know much about this, but there was a claim that you have some of the oldest rock art in the world.
Yeah, there are a lot of claims made about ancient Tibet, and some of them filter down into the
literature.
Not so scholarly world, and some may be based in fact, and some may be based in fancy. I mean, I don't think Tibetan rock art, there are very few indications that any of it predates the Bronze Age.
Okay.
And most of it post-dates the Bronze Age and dates to the late Bronze Age and after because of the presence of the riding horse. And we know that these equestrian arts were first appear in the scene in Inner Asia, in Mongolia, around 1300 BC, among horse burials among the Kirtik seers and deer stones, the mounds and funerary mounds and standing stones of Mongolia.
Tell me about the standing stones. I've seen them in Siberia, but I would be curious to know a bit more about them in Tibet. Standing stones.
Several they're funerary ritual sites. Exactly how they were used is questionable. None of them have been officially excavated because excavation in Tibet is very difficult, and Chinese archaeologists they're very much in the infancy of digging. But some of them have been informally excavated by the herders, where they found, not unlike in Mongolia, they found caches of horse bones.
Okay.
In place among the standing stones. There's there's three major types. There are isolated standing stones. There are standing stones enclosed in an enclosure where the standing stones sit on the west side of the enclosure. And then there are these incredible monuments with hundreds, in some cases, thousands of standing stones in concourses appended to, I believe, are temple tombs, large edifices exhibiting sophisticated masonry found in Upper Tibet, found nowhere else, not found in adjoining Ladakh or Central Tibet area, regions of like Lhasa and Shigatse, but only found in the far west. So this is one of the hubs, this use of these large concourses of standing stones, one of the hubs of this late prehistoric civilization.
So what's the next project for you? What's on your mind right now, and where are you going to go, and what are you going to do?
It's a good question. Well, I'm going to finish this rock art. Right now, I'm all in. I'm working feverishly to finish the rock art series, the books. Comprehensive Study of Rock Art, which is an open source resource for ArchaeoPress. And then from there, I have another project for the second half of the year working on artifacts, a special class of these talismans made
What are
cast bronze. Well, they're called tochas, thunderstones, or primordial metal. And you have this tradition even in many places in Eurasia, including Europe, of these early thunderstones, these materials that are believed to have fallen from the sky, and some of them do contain meteoric metals. So, in a sense, the legends are correct. So, I have a project in the second half of the year to write up a catalog, and then I have a few other projects I would like to complete. Fortunately, I was able to complete a lot of my projects already, but there's always stuff to do, and I'd like to finally go back to Old Tibetan text, because there's several manuscripts that I would like to work on. I think they could give us real insight into early Tibet, and that we can, use in tandem with the archaeology. The text can be an interpretive tool.
Sounds fantastic. Well, this has been a remarkable hour-long odyssey, and I so appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule, Dr. Bellezza. So it's a blessing and a wonderful honor to have you on board. And thank you for the time and the energy and your insights and wisdom off of your lifelong research. Fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. Very much appreciated.
Okay, gang. See you on the flip-flop.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.archpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.